Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, and a big thanks to all of you who have subscribed. And here on my channel, as you know, it's all Beatle talk, and we have lots of wonderful guests that we welcome to the show. And this time out, two gentlemen that you may know, I have interviewed with several co-hosts of mine on the two podcast shows that I do, Things We Said Today and Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast. We'd like to introduce, first of all, Jason Kruppa. He is the producer of a wonderful podcast show called Producing The Beatles, which you should all check out. And Ken Womack, who is actually, when it comes to Talk More Talk, kind of like there's a fifth Beatle. He's a fifth Talk More Talk on the show.
I'm a fifth talker.
That's right. And he's written a slew of books, which hopefully is all in your Beatle library. The Beatles Encyclopedia, 2 books on George Martin, Maximum Volume and Sound Pictures. Also recently with Kid O'Toole, Fandom And The Beatles, a book on the Abbey Road album and studio, Solid State, and John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. And these two gentlemen, just a few months ago, released this book called All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs. And we welcome both of them to the show. Welcome, Jason and Ken.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Ken.
Let's start by just saying that I'm letting everybody in on a secret here, which is that anytime that I'm interviewing someone for this channel that I know I'm going to be interviewing on my podcast, I always make sure that I save questions that aren't used in the podcast shows for this interview, so that it's not just a complete rehash of what was covered in the other shows, but there may be some carryover and, you know, a little bit of repeat. But for the most part, most of everything that we'll be talking about will be fresh and new compared to what we talked about in the other 2 podcasts. But I want to start by a little tidbit of information that I caught on to early on in your book. And actually, this has to do with the song For Your Love from the Yardbirds, which was their first really big hit. And in the book, you actually say that there was some intention for the Beatles to record this song.
I do believe we said that. Now, I think if one were to go back to that period, anybody who's writing songs would probably be hoping the Beatles would record them. And certainly in the earliest days of their story, it was only becoming widely known that they produced their own material. But yeah, I mean, our sources told us that there was some interest in trying to approach them in that way. We all know how history went, though, right?
Sure. I mean, by that point, you know, they were writing their own material. Most of what they were doing was original material. So, but it's kind of interesting that they even thought that the Beatles would cover that song. You're so used to the Yardbirds recording of it. Can't really hear a Beatles recording it For Your Love. Me personally, anyway. And it's interesting that Graham Goldman was the writer of the song, and he went on to be an all-star with Ringo.
A 10cc'er, right?
Yes. Yeah. 10cc figures very prominently in Beatle history, especially with Paul there. Also, going back to joining the Quarrymen, according to George, he actually said the other members of the Quarrymen didn't seem to be doing anything. So I said, let's get rid of them, then I'll join. Where did you come up with that? Because I don't recall ever reading that anywhere else.
Well, you'd have to look at the citation on that one, Ken. I'm sure it's in there. But yeah, George believed that one of his first important duties was to begin systematically ridding the Quarrymen of all of the other Quarrymen, save John and Paul. And Paul was happily in with him on that mission.
Okay. I don't know. I always thought he wouldn't be that intrusive, you know, that early on in his career, but it's kind of interesting that he said that. I'm going to bounce around a lot here, but I was curious if either one of you could tell me, since I was very young when this was happening. You were younger than me, but when was it actually made public that Eric Clapton played on While My Guitar Gently Weeps? I know they had to be kept hush hush for a while. Would either of you know?
Ooh, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I'm sure at some point that crossed in front of us, but yeah, I don't remember. I mean, it would have come out of one of the music papers. It's probably some, oh, let's look at this. We found this out, but I don't remember what date that was.
No.
Right. And of course, things were so much more folkloric, weren't they?
Yeah.
The way information would be, it would be a kind of lore, the way people would learn things, and often, as we know, a lot of the things we learned were mythos that
Sure.
weren't true, because of course, Eric couldn't have a courtesy reference on the White Album. Record companies didn't operate that way back then. It actually meant money changing hands and licensure and those sorts of things. So I think it was pretty well known by the early 70s, possibly even 69.
Okay.
And I mean, that's the reason George had to appear as, L'Angelo Misterioso for Cream, because he couldn't be listed either.
Or Paul Ramon,
Right.
that kind of stuff.
It all sounds funny in retrospect, though, because they should have had enormous power. Paul McCartney or George Harrison could say, "I'm going to be on these albums. What are you going to do about it?"
Yeah.
Well, interesting though. Yeah. Something you wrote in here that I found, I wasn't aware of this, that George invited Phil Spector to be in on the Instant Karma sessions.
Yeah.
Because I thought the whole Phil Spector thing was the result of Alan Klein bringing him in.
I think he brought him in to look at the Get Back tapes, but George showed up at Apple. This is from an interview with George. I think that was from the press kit or some video surrounding the 30th anniversary re-release of All Things Must Pass. And he said he showed up and saw Phil there. He says, "Well, why don't you come down?" He said, "Oh, I haven't been invited." He's like, "Oh, come on, just come with me." So he took him down, and this is in the book. He says he just kind of stands in the back of the control room for a while, and George is like, "Do something, come on." And so finally he just takes charge. And that's how he became producer of that session. Klaus talked about how, there's this voice coming from the control room they don't recognize. And then he's telling to do, Alan to take the cymbals off the drums and to get this sound that he's going for.
Well, I know the Beatles were fans of Phil Spector's work, and you would have thought maybe John Lennon would have had a lot more input there in wanting Phil Spector to produce it.
I mean, I think he was probably aware of the fact that Spector was in town to look at the tapes. I mean, that was probably not a secret. And George might have said, "Hey, I brought Phil down. He was at the Apple offices." So John tells it a different way, where he's, he is more involved in that story. But George's version is what we lean on in this, because this is George's story.
Right.
So we talk about his memories of this experience.
And John, of course, was famous for using shorthand.
Yes.
Telling his story. So he wanted to get a song out very quickly. Phil's there. And there's a certain energy to the way John tells it.
Right. Which we include, but I mean, to get a sense of both sides, we're letting both George and John speak.
Okay. We've talked about this in the other shows, but I think it's really important to bring up the Delaney and Bonnie tour and how important it was at that time.
Hugely important. I mean, George and Eric were both fans. George even tried to get their debut album put out on Apple, even though they were signed to Elektra, which, apparently there's some copies out there with the Apple label on them. But, big fans. And I think it's sort of in that same spirit of, everybody was a fan of the band, and in that sort of roots rock with some gospel, with some soul, with some R&B all mixed in. And, Delaney he was a charismatic person. He was kind of a jerk too, but he had this knack for gathering talented people around him and encouraging to do good work. So, that's where Eric first meets basically the Dominoes. what will become Derek and the Dominoes. And George gets this experience of, just like he had with the band from the year before with Bob Dylan in Thanksgiving '68, where he's with this communal group of people who are all having a great time, and it's kind of rough and ready, and he doesn't have to be the star. He can just kind of blend in, and he's happy to blend in. He there's a great piece that Philip Norman wrote at the time, which we excerpt bits of it in the book, where he's on tour with them and he's watching this interaction. He's watching George and Eric in this atmosphere, and it's just a fascinating snapshot of, here's two of the most famous people in the world, and they're at a roadside diner, just kind of hanging out. And I think that was a big deal for both George and Eric. They got to not necessarily be in the spotlight and just kind of have fun.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that George must have loved it, and Eric being kind of inconspicuous at that time. Not a tour for themselves, not a Beatles tour, not a Cream tour, just hanging out. And
very low stakes on their part.
Was it publicized heavily that Eric and George were part of that tour?
It was in the music. It was in the music papers. Yeah,
Okay.
I've seen notices in the music papers that they would be, one date or another.
Okay, very interesting because of the friendships that started during that tour, and Derek and the Dominoes ending up on All Things Must Pass and all. We've also brought up, and I find this really fascinating because, when you talk about the Beatle breakup, it's just so complicated. And when it comes to George Harrison, the fact that he wanted to have a permanent backing band for Apple, I find really, really fascinating, because to me, it shows that he was investing his time and his career in the label, which to me also means that he envisioned that the Beatles were going to continue further.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he says that several notable times, first half of 1970, before he records All Things Must Pass, he says, I think, in a few months we'll get tired of doing our solo things and we'll get back and we'll do another Beatles album. And at one point he says, I think it would be selfish for us not to do that because it means so much to so many people. And
at the same time, during the Get Back sessions, he says to John, I'm thinking about making a solo album.
Yeah. And John's encouraging it,
Right.
But I think that was one of the big surprises for me in researching this, is how many times George gives this positive vision of the future for the Beatles in the first half of 1970. And the Apple House Band is part of that. That he foresees himself being a kind of an Apple producer, and sort of over, at this point, he is really the voice of Apple. Everybody else is kind of withdrawn. Paul is isolated himself. John is kind of doing his own thing, and Ringo doesn't want to be in charge. So George is basically, he's the public face of this company. And so he's saying, like, this is what we'll be doing. This is what I'm planning to do. And, we're all kind of working on our solo projects. And so I think, to me, that was very surprising that he was so positive in the midst of this period that we think is so negative and so, the Beatles are breaking apart here. And he's just kind of blowing it off like, oh, John and Paul are just kind of being bitchy to each other,
Right.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
And it's so fascinating to me. I mean, obviously, the wealth of material coming out of George at the time that ends up on All Things Must Pass, but during this whole period, he's producing Jackie Lomax, he's producing Doris Troy, the Radha Krishna Temple, Billy Preston. I mean, so much activity there from this man. And I know that by the end of 1970, he was exhausted.
Yeah, I mean, he's playing on sessions, here and there, not just stuff that he's not producing. He just, he shows up and he's playing on something. That I'm the Spiritual Bread Man, the Bonzo record. Just lots and lots of activity. He's got a lot going on beginning in 1970.
I mean, for all purposes, he's Apple Records at this point in terms of A&R.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the closest to him is probably Mal. I mean, all kidding aside, he's really taken the reins of this utopian vision of theirs. And George is the working face, as you said, Jason, of the Beatles and of Apple as an artist-oriented organization.
That's so amazing. It's all four Beatles in their own way are very complicated. Maybe not Ringo as much as the others, but there's so many sides to them at different times in their careers. And certainly in 1970, the range of feelings between the four of what was going on. I mean, that is a book to itself.
Yeah.
George attended 7 sessions while Phil Spector worked on Let It Be. I find that to be amazing.
Yeah.
So is there any evidence of George communicating with any of the Beatles at that time about what Phil's doing?
I don't know. I don't have any hard evidence that he was, but I would imagine that he's in contact with John and Ringo because they're kind of all on the same page about what's happening. And Paul has isolated himself, but presumably he initially signed off on Spector taking control of the tapes. And even, as we know, even okayed the initial test pressings of the album before changing his mind and sending a note too late to make changes because he's changed his phone number and not told anybody. And so nobody can get in touch with him. So he's kind of shot himself in the foot in that respect, in that very critical period between when Spector could have made changes and when they start pressing the actual album.
But isn't it true also that when Paul was finishing up the McCartney album, he was doing it at roughly the same time as Phil Spector was working on Let It Be? So they must have been kind of next door to each other.
Yeah, and Abbey Road's not that big. I mean, it's not like you're down the hall 100 yards and not going to know what's going on. It would be incredible to me if they didn't run into each other or weren't aware of each other. There's no evidence. There are no interviews that say that they had any interaction, but I would imagine there had. I mean, you could also compartmentalize. If you just willfully want to shut all that out and concentrate on what you're doing, I guess you can do that. But we don't know. I mean, I don't know for certain. I haven't heard anything. I'd love to know one way or the other.
Well, I've never seen an interview with Paul where he's asked that question.
Right.
There's so many important questions that nobody ever gets to ask him.
Yeah.
And as more information becomes available, you want to ask so much more about this very, sensitive time in their history. Also, you say
that's such a good point too, because so much of the Beatles sessions are now well documented, and we understand how many takes and what takes were made. I sure would like to know what you were just talking about now, right? I would like to know more details about those sessions.
Yeah, the Let It Be sessions, you mean?
You bet.
With Phil Spector, yeah. I mean, and George is the only one that was visiting Phil and listening to what he was doing.
Right.
And I've
Klein was there too. And so I suspect, Paul would not have wanted to be in the same room with Klein. And he was concentrated on his own album. He seems, this is, again, no evidence, but he seems anecdotally and just what you can gather from studying his behavior, he's very kind of like got blinders on and he's working on his own project. And he's out of touch. There's a point where I think John says he hasn't talked to Paul in a couple of months. So, he does make himself unavailable for a period of time.
It's hard to believe. Only because of the fact that physically they're in the same building. It doesn't take much to go out of one room, one studio into another.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, in those two rooms, if you're talking about, 2 and 3 and 2 and 1, I mean, you're talking about feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can hear what's happening. They're not that well soundproof now. You can
Paul is in room 4 is a mixing room, and then Spector is recording in I forget the dates exactly, there's only one real crossover date, isn't there? I wrote this and I don't remember it.
Yeah.
But it's in the book. But there is a crossover date, and I mean, whatever is happening, they're in very close proximity to each other.
I just remember like the last songs that Paul worked on were, well, I think the very last was Man Me Was Lonely. And I think it could have been Maybe I'm Amazed before that. But even still,
Yeah.
I can't believe he wouldn't be curious enough. Well, if Alan Klein's in the room, I can understand it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this also drives home a point that you were just talking about. While in New York, before playing on Bob Dylan's rehearsals for New Morning, he stopped by at the Beatles fan club office and told the fans that the Beatle breakup was only temporary while they do their own albums.
Yeah, and that's the third time during that New York trip that he says that. In two other interviews, he alludes to his belief that they're gonna play together again. Or he downplay. I mean, this is after Paul's announcement. You know, he's downplaying this whole idea of a Beatles split.
Right.
There's another interview that he apparently did with someone at a Yonkers newspaper, which I have not been able to find. So if anybody out there is from Yonkers and has access to the newspaper archive, please get in touch with me. I want to see, if he says something similar in that interview. But yeah, 3 times at least.
I wonder at what point did George feel like the breakup really is happening? Because only then could he probably feel comfortable starting to record All Things Must Pass.
I would invert that question, Ken. Jason and I, we were speaking about this a couple nights ago. It's less about when did it feel like a fait accompli to him, but more like when he didn't want to go back.
Yes.
Might be the more interesting question. So he's open to it in those interviews, and including the intrepid reporters in Yonkers, right? But there comes a time when he is going to say, Jason,
no, he
that he doesn't want to play with Paul McCartney anymore.
Right. He has these experiences throughout recording, because initially starting the recording of the album, he's not as secure in the quality of the songs, and he doesn't know how people are going to respond. And to me, the big contrast here is the song All Things Must Pass, where in January 69, he's having a really hard time getting anybody interested in it. It's just not clicking. And for his own album, everybody sees the quality of the song. And Alan White said, when you have a song that good, it's just not hard to play. It's not hard to figure out to, sort of get into the groove of playing that. So he's having a much, much different experience with these people that he's gathered around him. Many of whom are part of this idea of the Apple House Band. And also people, Alan White, he played with, previously, but he asked him to play on the Radha Krishna Temple album because, they had this rapport with each other. He's working with people now who are giving him much different energy and responses to his material. And it's in the sessions themselves, I think it's an altogether positive experience. The things that are going on around the sessions, there's some, a lot of tensions, obviously, from various directions, but the sessions themselves and recording and getting this positive feedback is really a new experience for him. And they do this for weeks and weeks and weeks, just these basic tracks. And by the end of it, they've recorded 18 songs. So just think of, recording over, a couple of months' time, and you had this great experience. And then you think, oh, do I have to go back to the Beatles? That wasn't such a great experience a lot of the time. So, I think the shift was in him and sort of saying like, well, maybe I don't want to do this anymore.
As much as I want to focus on George and Eric, what you just said about the problems that George had with Paul, can you speak more about that? I mean, why specifically Paul and not, say, John? John and Paul were responsible for George having the few songs on Beatles albums. Granted, early on, he wasn't that prolific. Okay, but as he was starting to flourish and coming up with more and more material, he still was limited. It was always John and Paul's show, even though John did propose the
Yes.
next Beatles album be more evenly balanced, with 4 from each. But
Right.
why do you suppose the problem was more with Paul than John?
Ken has a good take on this. I agree with him, that Paul just had this like baby brother attitude toward George that he really, really never let go of. Never. And I think there came a point where George just, he could not stomach it anymore. And even in that, that 69 meeting where they're proposing, John's proposing a more equal, division, Paul is so just dismissive, he's telling George, your songs just weren't good enough, which we know is not true. They didn't fit the mold of what Paul's vision of the band was, but they were still objectively good. So, there's that idea of, Paul and John sort of created this, the Lennon McCartney thing. And then that's really what the sort of picture of the Beatles was. And George's contributions were kind of sidelong to that. They fit in, but they were kind of gatekeeping. They were saying like, well, this fits in close enough with our vision. I don't think that was a conscious, conversation, but that's the impression I get in seeing how this all plays out.
I love that quote in the anthology where George, when he's being interviewed contemporaneously, says that, part of the challenge was we have all these songs, right? And finding a way to have them see the light of day in the recording studio, much less be produced and end up on an album. It's not happening fast enough for him.
Right.
Yeah.
And he follows that in early 1970, where he says, at this rate, we're all producing so many songs, we just, we can't put them all on a Beatle album. They were all so productive at that, in 1969 and early 70. So, he's sort of letting people in on that idea. And he does talk about that meeting. He alludes to it in one of the May 1970 interviews.
Yeah. But it's kind of odd that, with the exception of George songs and the Beatles that require a band, I mean, Within You, Without You did not require the other Beatles, but the other songs that were George songs, Paul was always there for George.
Yeah.
And there's a number of songs where John doesn't play on them.
Right.
And George notices.
Yeah.
So why isn't he upset with John?
They have a different dynamic. I mean,
Right.
I think John could be dismissive too. And again, that goes back to his moods. I mean, he says when he there's a story we have in the book where he comes to Friar Park, and he's apparently heard the album. The best I can piece together, he's heard the album at some point during mastering in early October, and he's supportive. And then he sees the album out, and there's 3 records, and he's really kind of dismissive about this. So again, that's mood. What's his frame of mind when he's saying that? We don't know. We don't know what's happening exactly in his life at that point. That's inside him. But the fact that he's proposing a way forward in September 1969, he's saying, we're producing work. We should all have equal time on the albums. Suggests to me that he's trying to look for a way forward for the band, which is saying we need to include George. George is an equal. So,
but a week later, everything changed.
Yeah. But then,
What a difference a week makes.
Yeah, my question though is, how, again, things are so unstable with John in particular. How are we to know that a week later things aren't going to change back? And I think this is part of what George's response is in early 1970, where he's saying, well, John and Paul are just, they're kind of having a spat, and he's kind of seen this before, and he's not taking it seriously. He left the band and everything was okay. Ringo left the band and everything was okay. John says he's quitting. It's going to be okay.
I like that, Jason, because of course, George also saw those spats when nobody knew who the hell they were, right? He probably saw those spats in Hamburg or
Hmm.
back at home in Liverpool.
Yeah.
Let me ask you guys this one question. This is something that I've only now thought about. But
Is
with
it about
Eric,
Alan? Is it about Alan Kozin?
no. I'm saving that towards the end. Save the best for last there. But with George bringing Eric Clapton in on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, once George left during the Let It Be sessions, and then John said, we'll get Clapton. And then John ended up using Clapton on Cold Turkey, and Live Peace in Toronto. Do you think that was a way of saying, well, George can get him, I can get him too? Was there like this competitive thing going on there between John and George?
I mean, Ken, what do you think? I'm not really, I don't see it competitive. I just sort of see like Eric's in their circle and he's open to this stuff and they both know him. What do you think, Ken?
And most importantly, when it came time to do Toronto on incredibly short notice, Eric said yes. I mean,
and George didn't want to, we don't have anything to do with that.
Yeah, so it was an audition that Eric couldn't possibly fail. I don't mean to put it in the same bracket, but it's almost like Pete Best in 1960, right? He's going to Hamburg.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering because certainly at that point, Eric Clapton was viewed as, like a guitar god. Certainly.
Literally.
Yeah. So if George could get him. And then there was a letter that John wrote to Eric, and I think this was after the concert for Bangladesh, that he wanted to put a band together and tour with it and have Eric in it. So part of me is thinking, well, could this be because George could rely on Eric and Eric plays on his stuff and now all things must pass and the concert for Bangladesh? Or they're all just friends?
I think they're all traveling in the same circles, and I think he likes what he's doing, and obviously having Eric Clapton in your band is going to be that's going to be good for the marquee value, right?
Yeah, sure. And if only for a very short time because your band is going to break up,
right?
I mean, you have to keep that in mind. You know what? If you want a band to break up and it's 1968, Eric's your guy.
Yep. Mm-hmm. He can do the job.
He'll get it done. Yeah. Ken, we've done so much media for this book, and you are the most in-depth interviewer I want to say we've ever encountered. I mean, you are I want to read your Beatles book, buddy.
Yeah. When is that coming out?
No, I'm only going to write one if you guys help me with it.
Okay.
I need collaborators. Anyway, so let's talk about George and Phil Spector and All Things Must Pass. And you have quotes from various musicians in the book of, who was more in control. What, from your perspective, how much input did Phil Spector have? Of course, there's the wall of sound and everything, but I always get the feeling that no matter what, George had the final say on everything. And I want to bring up this interview that Phil Spector gave to Anthony DeCurtis. I'll bring that up in just a few moments, but if you can kind of answer the question about the dynamic between George and Phil Spector and how they got along.
Well, Klaus called it a partnership, I think. We quote him as that in the book. And George had been a producer now on a number of projects, and he was more than capable. But the problem is if you're producing yourself, you can't be behind the glass and in the studio at the same time. So it helps to have somebody in the other room saying, okay, that was a good take, or, working on the sound, or I heard this off, or, oh, wait, stop, that didn't work. And that freed George up to just concentrate on the arrangements in the studio. He could be with the musicians. So as just practically speaking, it was a division of duties, just so one person didn't have to do both things. Creatively speaking, I mean, it starts out very Wall of Soundish with Wah Wah and My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity. And you can see, as we trace this through the book, George at some point kind of pulls back, and then it's the more acoustic, oriented stuff, and it's Behind That Locked Door, and it's you know,
Apple Scruffs.
yeah, well, Apple Scruffs is later, but I Live for You,
Hmm.
and these little, so like he's changing the mood, and you know, this kind of happens after with the second version, and Isn't It a Pity, because that's a smaller scale recording. It's not a room full of musicians, and the sound is different. And then from that carries on these kind of smaller scale, except for the song All Things Must Pass. But and you know, then Pete Drake comes in at that period. So this is, you know, it's changing the mood from wall of sounds to kind of acoustic, a little bit countrified. And at the end of that is when Derek and the Dominoes actually coalesce, become a group, do their first performance, get their name, and then they come in a few days later to resume sessions for George, and you can hear their sound just dominate. They take over for the rest of the record. So you get songs like What Is Life, and you get Waiting for You All. You get these big, you know, big sounding productions, and that meshes well with, you know, Spector's approach too. So it's sort of more back from that quiet acoustic thing to the more, you know, raucous, big rock and roll sound.
You know, to answer your question, Ken, I mean, Jason, it's safe to say, right? At a certain point later in the summer, Phil really takes a role of advisor more than as a consultant, almost more than a producer, because George is going to oversee his own post-production, which will be late.
Right, but as far as tracking sessions, which are, you know, the first couple of months, what we're talking about, that Spector is mostly in charge, and George is sort of doing a push and pull with him, saying, you know, I don't really want all these people here. And Klaus confirmed that. He said, you know, there would be times where he would want the mood to be different, and he would sort of thin players out. Somebody, you know, was maybe the wrong energy in the room. So, you know, George had control over that kind of stuff. Once the tracking sessions end and George begins post-production, that's when Spector, you know, begins to drift, he begins to drink, and becomes unstable and leaves for a while. When he comes back, really George is the one in charge of post-production. Even though Phil is, you know, advising, like you say, and he's giving input, George is having to carry most of the weight at this point.
So Phil was getting upset by George.
No, he was just disinterested, because he's just sitting there watching George add his guitar parts, or maybe add a vocal overdub or percussion overdub. So he's not as engaged. You know, he's going like, okay, well, that's good. But in creating the wall of sound, this large group of musicians, he's directing people what to do, what to play, how to double these parts, how to get Phil McDonald to get the sound that he wants.
Right.
So he's got to be engaged in fashioning this sound for the basic tracks. Once they get to post-production, and George really is kind of obsessive and knows what he wants, and is, you know, going over and over these guitar parts and these vocal parts, that's when Spector's just kind of like, you know, I don't really need to be here for this.
See, what I would have loved to have been like you guys in on these sessions, but what intrigues me the most isn't just how great these songs are, but that George must have had such a great ear for knowing what musicians to pick for each song. I mean, just going by the keyboards alone, you know, you've got Gary Wright, you've got Gary Brooker, you've got Bobby Whitlock. And so how do you know? They're all so great. You know, how do you know which one you're going to use on this song? Not this song, but I mean the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, some of it is down to personality. I think he was grooving on people's personality and the mood that they would bring to a session, and I think that would play a part in the performances that they would deliver. You know,
it's also timing, though, right? I mean,
sure.
Like you just described it, there's an organicism to who's in the studio when.
Yeah. And Bobby Whitlock was there, you know, for the most part throughout from the beginning with Eric, although there would be days where they weren't there for various reasons. And, you know, but their personalities were going to bring a certain vibe to the room. And whereas, you know, Billy Preston's vibe would be different.
Right.
You know, he's coming from a different perspective, and, you know, Gary Wright is going to bring something different, and Gary Brooker is going to bring something different. So, and John Barham, who was the arranger, was there for everything. George wanted him there from the beginning. So he's playing keyboards on some stuff. So it's, it is down to kind of, I think, what George thinks is going to work for them. I think the more sensitive songs, the quieter songs, that's where I think George was really more particular. The bigger stuff, he's kind of letting, Spector run the show at the beginning.
Right.
And then, as I said, when Derek and the Dominoes kind of take over their sound, you can tell like the drumming is more powerful, and the whole vibe of it is just like they're on fire, and they're really powered by that. And those recordings are powered by that. If you look in the book and you look at the songs they're recording, they all kind of share that quality.
Right. Talk about the importance, he's a name that doesn't get mentioned that much at all, of John Barnum, and the scores that he did, because you said that there's 9 of them. He did for 9 of the songs.
Is it 9 or 10? I mean, maybe it's 10. I'd have to look. Yeah, he had known George since 1966. He was Ravi Shankar's assistant in London. He had one of the first things he did was to transcribe some Indian ragas for piano. And this is in like 65, 66. And then he worked with Ravi to prepare the Indian music for Ravi's collaboration with Yehudi Menuhin, to sort of translate that. And so he had this ability to shift back and forth between, basically these thoughts. So he's navigating both those worlds. Just a very accomplished musician in his own right. He meets George in 66 and they become friends. And he says, I think George was inviting me into his world. He's playing him. He says he remembers him playing all these different types of music. So he's playing everything from, blues records, blues pianists, and, they're listening to avant-garde classical music. Georgi Ligeti is one of the people he mentions. So, he's bringing him into his world, and they're communicating with each other musically. Barham, I think, is a very important figure to George during this period. Works with him on Wonderwall, and he does all the scoring for this. And George has him at all the All Things Must Pass sessions. And even before then, he invited him over to Friar Park, and they had Indian food. And then afterward, George just got his guitar out and played all the songs for him. And he said, I think what he was doing was just sort of giving me a feel of what this record is going to be like, and to get me accustomed to how these songs sound. So he's planting a seed very early with John. And so, John has a sense by the end when they start, in post-production, when he writes these arrangements, he has a great feel for these songs. He already knows them inside out. And what George does is basically says, if he wants a melody line, he'll tell him that and play it on piano or guitar. And then John went out and fleshed that arrangement out for, strings. And in the case of Is It a Pity, a whole woodwind section, which we can talk about later. But he's very, very involved in this process.
Yeah, one of the versions of Isn't It a Pity on the box set has George singing that line, da 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 da, which I found, it just shows that was in his mind already.
Yeah.
And those are just beautiful scores. During our presentations associated with this book, Jason has been putting together just amazing isolations that really highlight the wondrous sound that lives inside those scores. And they're just a thing of beauty.
Just like we've had some of the isolated tracks on Beatles stuff that George Martin did, his scoring. Sure would be nice if we had the same thing with John Barham.
Well, we have 2 of them now, because I commissioned a composer in the UK to recreate My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity using orchestral sample libraries from the BBC. So it's not, it's not ideal in that you would have an actual orchestra, but that's prohibitively expensive. But this is the next best thing. And I'll be doing 2 episodes on My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity for the podcast where I can demonstrate that. But we've used that in our presentations, and it's gotten a great response. People have responded, as you would expect they would respond to isolated Beatles scores. It's just to me, I can sit here and describe to you how profound it is to hear the layers peeled back and to hear all of this detail that we don't necessarily consciously know is there, but
Right.
emotionally feel. But to hear it is another experience entirely.
So much of what gets put into these orchestral arrangements is so subtle, and you don't realize it. If you hear it by itself, you would. But
Yeah,
I mean, even like a song like Something.
yeah,
I mean, I overlooked the work that George Martin did on a song like that. It's so easy to get so consumed with what the band is doing that you don't
yeah.
pay attention to the orchestration too.
It,
So
it wasn't until Anthology and the DVDs and then the 5.1 isolated channels got ripped and were floating around the ether that I heard the isolated score. And all these years on headphones, whatever, I had never registered that there was a whole pizzicato part on the strings in the bridge. And it was just like, what? This is here? Are you
yeah.
kidding me? So yeah, there's a ton of work, and it's so subtle, and it's meant to blend in with the overall tapestry. It's not meant to necessarily stand out, which is a tribute to, you know, their skill as arrangers.
Right. I just want to bring up, because I mentioned this before. I have a feeling I know how you guys are going to feel about this, but there was an interview that I read that Anthony DeCurtis from Rolling Stone did with Phil Spector, and this was around the year 2000. And I know how people feel about Phil being crazy. I think at this time, at least the way he was speaking, he was fairly lucid and making sense, but he was giving his own comparison of what it was like to work with John versus George. And he said that John was much more sure of himself. He was far more immediate. He wanted to get the recordings done quickly, even though there's bootlegs out there of many takes of songs that John did, but still, John went a lot for feel, whereas George would do take after take after take. He was so much of a perfectionist, but at the same time, in his mind, in Phil's mind, he was very insecure about himself. And he felt that the reason why George had to ask so many superstar friends to be on All Things Must Pass was because he was insecure. Have all these great musicians surrounding you, as opposed to, you know, John, even though John used Eric Clapton too, but, you know, much fewer musicians like on Plastic Ono Band, for example. So, you know, it's just his own observations. He was a brilliant man in his own way, you know, and I remember seeing an interview that Leon Russell did where he's talking about, and he didn't mention what song it was. It was driving him crazy that the band had to keep doing take after take of a certain song. And so he said, you know what, George, listen to this. And he played him one of the takes, and George said, that's better than all of them. And it was like the first or second take, you know, of the song. So George didn't realize how early on, how good those takes were. But, you know, in Phil's mind, he thought that George was extremely insecure, as opposed to John being, you know, far more secure, even early on in the solo years of the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can attribute that to, you know, John and Paul and George Martin gatekeeping and saying, you know, like, your songs are not good enough. I mean, you hear that enough, and it's sort of like, okay, well, I'm going to keep writing, but they're probably not good enough. You know, he's struggling with that, and I think part of this, with the, you know, multiple people, a large group of people on All Things Must Pass, I think is also coming out of the experience of being with the band and Bob Dylan and being with Delaney and Bonnie, and just enjoying that camaraderie. You know, enjoying the sort of like a bunch of people who are on your groove, contributing to your songs and really feeling them, and like, yeah, this is great. This is a lot of fun. I mean,
by the way, that does cohere with George's life,
yeah.
right? He liked to have a party where everybody gets invited. Now, as Jason has shown, as the sessions moved forward, the funnel closes and not all of the musicians are still there. You know, so he has enough confidence to say, thanks for coming, but we don't need you today. You know, so he's able to close that funnel. You know, and John Lennon's sureness about himself could also be his impatience for the recording process, right? So you can invert these things. Now, I say all that recognizing that I didn't know these guys personally and Phil did.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think Phil was very insightful and very sensitive. So I think, yes, let's give some credit to his observations in this regard.
Hmm. Okay. Before we close, we didn't spend that much time about how George and Eric and their friendship benefited each other. I mean, you can go on for an hour just on that alone, but if you
Sure.
could say something concisely about that,
Sure.
what would you?
So, we've done such a deep dive on this, and as you know, Ken, from your own voluminous work, George Harrison had a really generous spirit to him, and we see that when you start to study this relationship being extended over and over and over again, where George wants to help Eric. George realizes that Eric is in some ways broken by his own youth, right? George just comes off as such a sympathetic figure. The more time you spend with him, he is the one who would eat his ego and rejoin the Beatles because he recognized what they were doing was bigger than themselves. And Eric certainly lives inside that space for him. They first meet at, as you know, one of the Christmas concerts, and they get to talk guitars, which is exciting for George and Eric. But George also notes that Eric is somebody he wants to befriend because Eric needs a friend. That's part of what attracts George to him. He sees someone he can help, and there's a convivialness, a conviviality, a convivialitude. I don't know what the adjective is. A convivial nature that exists inside their friendship that seems to, throughout their lives, exist beyond anything that may happen with, say, somebody's wife. There's something that they value, and even George, as we've written, going to Eric and making sure he had a place, even though he was in certainly a troubled spot concerning his own drug abuse at the time. He had a place on the stage for Bangladesh, right? George carved that out for him and saw to it that he showed up.
Yeah, he and Patty both were, instrumental in getting Eric on stage for that. So to me, that speaks volumes, as does, George's observation when he sees him in, what is that, 65, 66, where he sees him and they're leaving a club and they see Clapton and he says in an interview, he says, I thought we should ask him to come with us. He looked lonely.
Right.
What an observation to make. That to me was such an insight into George's character, and then also how he and Eric had this kind of dynamic where George was kind of reaching out and looking after him to a certain extent.
But around that time, late 60s, early 70s, Eric had so much commercial success with Cream. The Layla album did very well. The first Eric Clapton album did extremely well. One could say, why would someone need to help him at that stage? I mean, apart from the drug problem.
Well, it's a personal thing. I mean, I think, George, is incredibly successful. So he's seeing somebody who is at least an equal in some regard. But I don't think it's a commercial professional thing. I think it's more of a personal connection, and he's seeing this. At this point, the relationship, I think, is ongoing from the evidence that we were able to find from George's generosity. Eric is able to repay that later on, but in this period, he's not really in much shape to do much himself. The drugs really tear him down a lot for several years.
Is there a similarity that you'll find in when George brought Billy Preston in for the Let It Be sessions to, bring more professionalism into the sessions there? I hate to say it that way, but, to up their game, to make sure that they were performing better. It could have been the same thing when he brought Eric in for While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Oh, sure. It was a gambit to get them to behave, to
In
get
his words,
to get them to focus.
Right. And his words, to be less bitchy,
Right,
Hmm.
right.
Okay. Oh, one last thing. I think you mentioned this in the book. I'm not sure. But the four gnomes that are on the lawn there at Friar Park, are they supposed to be the four Beatles?
That's George alludes to that. He says it's sort of like, you know, it's the four Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo around me.
Hmm. Do you know when he said that? Because
It's in the, you'd have to check citation in the book. I don't remember
yeah.
exactly when that was.
It's pretty early on, actually, when he makes a remark about the cover. But see, I tell you, Jason, I think Ken Michaels is writing a book about this. Really
No, I'm not.
specific information. That's the book I want to read.
All right. Well, this has been wonderful having the two of you on, and you're always welcome to come back whenever you want. And individually, I'd like to talk to each of you on your own about your well, in your case, Ken, your books. I never did actually do an interview on the John Lennon book. Maybe, you know, at some point we can do something on that too.
You
Hey.
know, I love spending time with Ken Michaels, so I am the fifth. I'm the fifth talker.
And I want to talk to you, Jason, more about your podcast show, because you
Sure,
really go
sure.
into depth about individual songs and how they were produced. And, you know, something like, I think the first show was about In My Life and George Martin's piano solo in there and how that was done, which is all very fascinating. So, you know, anytime you want to come on here, you're more than welcome.
They sure are
Great.
great. And you know what makes those podcasts of Jason so wonderful is they're like miniature stories, right? You're almost having a story told to you, and who doesn't like that?
And the production, I know the word is used all the time, is so wonderful. And I love hearing isolated bits. You know, you can hear them, you can hear, you know, how that solo was done in
Yeah.
particular, that it was recorded slower and sped up, you know,
Right.
that kind of thing. And just to hear how that was done is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the process is, it's the focus on process. So it's, you know, the creative process is the recording process. And, you know, my concern is always that these complex ideas are presented clearly. And obviously I want, you know, the production, I want it to sound good. I have a secret life. Years ago, I wanted to be a recording engineer. So that's now playing out in these podcasts.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm glad you like it. And there will be more. So yes, be happy to talk about it with you
Well, I'll
sometime
tell you,
soon.
it's become more important to me how much George Martin needs to be even more respected for all the work that he's done. I mean, there's so much stuff that is overlooked that it's incredible. I just listened to a White Album bootleg, and I heard Honey Pie without the vocals. And it's just, you know, the arrangement of the horns and all, and it's brilliant. You know, it's these things that we just take for granted all the time.
Yeah.
And everybody points to the obvious songs, I Am the Walrus and Strawberry Fields and Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby, as they should. But there's so many other songs where he did tremendous work on. And, you know,
You
I'm
know,
sure.
a good tutorial on that, Ken. I had the great privilege of seeing Love again last week. And it's a wonderful experience anyway. But what you kind of walk away with, in addition to this beautiful, amazing world that the Beatles created with characters and settings and sound and color, is a lot of the musical bits that are finding life in that show are written by George Martin.
Yep.
Yep. That's why I'm grateful you wrote the 2 books that you did on him, Ken.
Okay, Ken.
Ken's.
All right. So thanks so much, guys, for joining me. And thanks to all of you for watching. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe. And always watch out for these 2 gentlemen on this channel and on my other podcast. Okay. Thanks so much for tuning in. And we'll see you next time.